Okay, so in this part of our tutorial, we're going to first create some of the calculation functions that we'll use. So the first one we'll create is just going to be a function that will choose the set of calculations to look into, because bear in mind there are 4 calculations only, but there are 5 variables, and in any given calculation there are 4 variables used, but we could be using any one of those. There's actually a very large number of combinations that we can choose from. So we're just going to design some functions that will basically choose which calculation to use. And then we're going to kind of set up the others, so we're going to declare these functions but not initialize them, so that we can call them in the functions to come and they're not going to give us trouble. Alright, so now it's time to write some functions that will actually select which calculations we're going to use. So we're going to call the first of them in here, and it's going to be a choose calculation function and calculation function. And because I haven't implemented yet, I'm just leaving it in a comment so that when we do come to implement it, then we can actually fill it in there. Okay, so this is where comments might be useful in the code. I've heard some people say you should comment everything, and a lot of people say you should comment nothing. So really it just comes down to matter of preference. For this kind of thing, I find it useful to have these comments. Okay, and for those of you who don't know what a comment's just something that it's just text within the code that isn't recognized by the compiler. So you can write whatever in this comment, and it's basically for your eyes only. The compiler pretends it doesn't exist. Okay, so what we're going to do is we are going to implement this first choose calculation function. So this is going to find out which variable is missing and then choose some calculations from there. So we're going to call this void choose calculation, and this is going to take in a string, and this is going to be the calculation. So we haven't worked a lot with functions that take in parameters. Basically, any function that takes in a parameter, when you call it, like we did up here, we have to pass it in a parameter of the appropriate type, and then it can use that parameter to do other things. So in this case, what it's going to do is it's going to take that calculation. We're going to first create a switch statement. So switch statements are a little like a big if statement, but I find they're a little more efficient and kind of easier to write. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a switch statement, and we're going to take in the variable to calculate. So this is the variable set in the missing variable spinner. So remember, we select one of the 5 missing variables from the spinner, and it's going to take this in, and depending on which variable that is, we're going to bring up an appropriate set of calculations. So the first case will be if it's final velocity, and what we're going to do is we're going to have some kind of function that's going to be choose final velocity functions, and we're going to break, and we're just going to do this a few times. I'm just going to copy and paste. So that's 1, that's 2, that's 3, and that's 4. So now we have all 5 cases. So first one is going to be final velocity, the second one is going to be initial velocity, the third one is going to be acceleration, the fourth one is going to be displacement, and the fifth one is going to be time. So these are our possible missing variables, and we're just saying that basically depending on which one we select. So let's say we select, I see what the problem is there. So we've selected one from the spinner, and we're saying depending on which one we select, then we should divert to the appropriate calculations. Okay, and we're going to call that in here. So we're going to call choose calculation, and we're going to pass it in the calculation to use. So what we're going to do there is we are basically just going to put in the calculation to use, and it's going to take that calculation to use, and it is going to do some stuff with it. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is we want to create functions that will handle. So basically we're going to have a function called each time. So these are not always going to be final velocity. There's going to be initial, it's going to be acceleration, displacement, and time. So we need functions to handle those. So what we're going to need to create 5 different functions here. One's going to be a choose final velocity calculation, and each one is going to take in a string that is going to be a calculation. And yeah, so this one is, so you should set it up properly. Yes, this one's going to take in a string calculation, and what we're going to do is I'm just going to copy this and paste it and paste it and paste it. And so that way I can just modify a little bit. For example, this one's the initial, this one is the acceleration, this one is the displacement, and this one is the time. Okay, so again, there's only 4 different calculations, but each of them are going to have to be manipulated so that we can use them in the code depending on which of the variables is missing. So it ends up being a lot of different combinations. And so let's go ahead and call them here. So in this case, we're going to choose final velocity calculation, and we're going to feed it the calculation that we passed in. This one is going to be choose the initial velocity calculation. Again, we're going to feed it in calculation. This one is going to be choose the acceleration function or calculation. This one is going to be displacement, and the last one's going to be time. Let's choose displacement calculation. And yeah, last one's going to be time. Okay, so what's going on here, just to kind of recap so far. So we have selected, at this point we will have selected a calculation to use from the calculation spinner, and we're calling this choose calculation function based on that. So it's going to take in the one that we've chosen, and it's going to basically pass the one we've chosen into the correct function here, which will choose the correct function again based on what was passed in. Okay, so this is where it gets a little bit hairy when we're filling in each of these. So before we do that, I just want to call some helper functions. And so those are going to basically be the actual calculate functions. So before we have a choose which function to use, and then we have the actual calculate function. So these won't perform any calculations. This one's just going to decide which way to manipulate the calculation, and these next set of functions, this is basically going to dictate which one we use. So this one's going to be the calculate final velocity, and it's going to take in a string which is going to be called variables. Okay, so we're going to do this for each of the variables. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And again, let's just set these up. This is acceleration. This one is displacement. And this one is time. Okay, so I'm just going to save it, and I'm going to stop here so we can recap exactly what's going on. So again, this choose calculation will determine which set of the choose calculations to use. So let's say we want to find final velocity. Well, there's still like several final velocity calculations that we could use. So then we'll call the final velocity calculation, and it will basically check to see, based on the variables that we do know, whether or not like which function that we're going to end up using. Okay, so this is going to become a bit more clear once we implement these, and we're going to do that right away, but I just kind of wanted to separate the two. And then these functions are all going to perform the actual calculations themselves. They're going to take in the variables and, multiply, subtract, divide, and add them as necessary. Okay, so now we have created some of the calculation functions in Android. So what we did is we first created the function that will start to narrow down the amount of calculations to use based on which variable was missing. So we will have chosen a missing variable, and then we will have chosen a calculation to perform. And this first function is going to kind of narrow down our list of choices based on which of the missing variables we chose. Okay, so by now you should start to see kind of where we're going with this code and think about which functions are going to call the others and how they're going to work. So we also set up a bunch of skeleton functions, so we haven't actually implemented them yet, trying to think about how exactly they're going to work. And we'll go ahead and implement them right away.